let me welcome and thank very much Mr. Ghassan Salamé for joining our class for the second year in a row. We are very honored and grateful for your presence, Mr. Salamé, and I share your biography with the students. You are professor of emeritus of international relations at Sciences Po in Paris, and you have also performed as the head of the UN support mission in Libya 2017-2020, UN SRSG. So from your perspective, you've seen things, a lot of things, and not always, as we were saying before, not always positive ones and easy ones to solve: crises, conflicts. The title of your presentation is the regulation of force and international system, and it's also the content is also part of the book that you have written. It's going to be published soon. So you've been analyzing for a long time the international system and the regulation of force. So I leave you the floor, Mr. Salamé. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm happy to see this young generation showing its interest in the study of the international system. I will try and be short, which is always a promise speakers take but never really respect, in order to give you some time to ask questions. And you can ask questions related to the topic or to parent topics of what I'm going to say. What do I mean by deregulation of force? You know that in economics, the deregulation means basically the eradication of a number of constraints on trade, on investment, and the opening up of markets to each other. But deregulation does not only apply to economics. In fact, you find deregulation every time you put the norms, the rules, the treaties, the laws a bit aside, and you operate in disrespect of these norms and laws and treaties. I think this applies also to the use of force. The use of force is something that has been considered as normal in many centuries and millennia of human history. However, in the 20th century, starting with the Hague Agreements of 1907, followed later by the Geneva Conventions, and also by the additional protocol to these conventions 20 years later, both what the medieval thinkers called the jus ad bellum, the right to go into war, and the jus in bello, that is how to behave if you start a war or if you are engaged in a war, have done an incredible amount of progress. This started mainly in the 19th century with a number of people calling for the cessation of any initiative that is an aggression against somebody else. You'll find this in the 20th century in a long number of resolutions and treaties. One of them is, of course, the Charter of the League of Nations, where in Article 10, it was said that the war is legitimate, but it needs to follow certain rules. And then you had an attempt in the famous Briand-Kellogg statement at the end of the 1920s where 63 countries, that is a large majority of independent states at that time, committed not to go into war. But you know that in 1939, that's exactly what they did. That is why the UN Charter, adopted in 1945 in San Francisco, came back and tried to regulate this. And you'll find this in particular in Article 2 of the UN Charter. Article 2, paragraph 4, that says that you cannot go in a war of aggression. You cannot violate the territorial sovereignty of your neighbor or of another country. But also you cannot acquire territory by force. And also, more importantly, because this was not there in the text adopted so far, you cannot interfere in the domestic politics of another country. So states are equal, sovereign, you do not interfere, you do not acquire their territory, and you do not start an aggression war against them, if you want to be faithful to the UN Charter. We find in the Charter another extremely important article. That's Article 51, that says there is an exception to all what I have been saying. And this exception is the legitimate defense. When you are attacked, you have the right to defend yourself. What happened, of course, is that in many cases, it became like a routine thing to do. A country that started a war said, I'm doing this in application of Article 51 in legitimate defense. Even Putin, when he attacked Ukraine in 2014 and annexed Crimea, he said he was operating under Article 51 of the Charter because the Russians or the Russian speakers in Ukraine were going to be imposed to speak in Ukrainian, which is an aggression against their human rights. So he intervened in order to stop that. This was an act of legitimate defense. When the Turks attack the Kurds in northern Iraq or in northeast Syria, they say it's a legitimate defense. When Israel now is in full swing in Gaza, having killed already around 30,000 people, including 10,000 children, it says it is in legitimate defense. So, as one judge at the International Court of Justice in The Hague said, I don't see wars anymore where everybody doesn't say it's a legitimate defense. But the interpretation that the Security Council of the United Nations and the International Court of Justice in The Hague gave to the legitimate defense was much more restrictive than these states wanted. Not everybody can say, I am operating in legitimate defense. And that is why when Italy attacked Ethiopia in the 1930s, it was not considered by the League of Nations as a legitimate defense, although the Italians said it is a legitimate defense. When President Reagan in 1986 attacked Libya under Gaddafi then, he said it was a legitimate defense, and the Security Council said, no, it is not a legitimate defense. When Israel attacked the PLO leadership in Tunisia in 1994, it also said it's legitimate defense, and the Security Council said, no, it is not legitimate defense. So the interpretation was quite constrained. Not everybody can say, I'm violating my neighbor's sovereignty because I'm in legitimate defense. You need to prove. You need to put the evidence that you are under an imminent threat from your neighbor, and that you have tried all other means to stop him from attacking you, diplomacy, mediation, arbitration, whatever, and that you have no other choice but to defend yourself. When this was the rule, then came 9/11 and the 21st century. And what we saw since 9/11, that is September 11, 2001, when New York and Washington were attacked by Al-Qaeda, we saw that the Security Council, as well as the International Court of Justice, became more laxist, more open, more flexible in the interpretation of legitimate defense. So they considered that the attack that the George W. Bush administration started against Afghanistan in 2001 as legitimate defense. And they decided that terrorism is an aggression, and therefore that you can do whatever you can in order to fight terrorism. At the same time, something else was happening. A lot of countries became unable to rule, a lot of governments became unable to rule their countries. We called them then failed states because of their inability to protect their population and to defend their territory. And again, the Security Council and the International Court of Justice started accepting the concept of the responsibility to protect. That is the idea that you can intervene in a country without being invited because you think that the government of that country has been unwilling or unable to defend its own population. This was a second reason why the concept of legitimate defense or the legality, the legality of military intervention became entrenched in international law and international practice. But if you are looking for an original sin for this, it is the concept of preventive war. The idea that you, on your own, decide that there is a danger that could come from one country. Not an imminent danger, as we used to say before, but a danger, a threat. And in order to destroy that threat, you engage in a preventive war against that country in order to stopping it from attacking you in a way or the other. And the first time this concept was put in application, in our times at least. In past times it had been used, but it has been considered by international law as unacceptable, as illegal. But the first time it was implemented openly and by the most powerful country in the world, that is the United States of America, it was in March 2003 when America attacked Iraq. America has been at war with Iraq 12 years earlier. But nothing is more different than the two wars between America and Iraq. The war of 1990 was a war that had been authorized by 12 successive resolutions of the Security Council. It was engaged by a coalition of 63 countries with the United States. And it had a very specific objective, which was to liberate Kuwait that had been occupied by Iraq and annexed by Iraq a few months earlier. So this was certainly illegal war, illegitimate war. More than that, it was the best example of what the United Nations is supposed to be. That is a machinery for collective security, that the international community acts as if an attack against one country, in this case Kuwait, is an attack against all. And the others have the full right to come and defend and liberate that country. The war of 2003, on the contrary, was never authorized by the Security Council. There was no resolution of the Security Council. Was not specifically meant to do something precise, like liberate Kuwait, but had the implicit objective of decapitating the regime of Iraq then, Saddam Hussein. And this was done in opposition to leading members of the international community, Russia, Germany, who was in the Security Council, France, the Pope, all were against that war and considered that war illegal. I was then working for the Secretary General of the United Nations as his senior advisor, Kofi Annan, and he paid a big price for going on the BBC and saying, this is an illegal war. But he was right. It was an illegal war. The war of 1990 was the model of collective security. The war of 2003 was illegal. Then something wrong happened, but natural, which is the process of emulation. If the leading country in the world, the country that has been behind the creation of the United Nations, the country that has been calling for a rule-based international system, if that country in particular takes the lead and contravenes all of this, then why would other countries not do the same? And that process of emulation is clear. In fact, what I told you now is exactly a quotation from Vladimir Putin himself, who said, if America can do this and this and this, why shouldn't I do the same? More importantly, the responsibility to protect was used once in a UN Security Council resolution. That is the resolution of 2011 that allowed for an intervention in Libya. But if you read that resolution very carefully, you will find that it is not authorizing NATO to go and depose Muammar Gaddafi. And the evidence was not put before the Council that the civilian population was really threatened and that a military alliance of Western countries has been allowed to go. That is why until now, not only Russia and China, but also most African countries consider that the West, that is then France, UK, Sarkozy in France and Cameron in UK, supported by Obama, in the view of the African countries and some big countries like China and Russia, have overstepped in their interpretation of that resolution. Therefore, what was clear in the immediate end of the Cold War, that is after 1990, was becoming murky, The interpretation of the resolutions, the use of preventive war, the ignorance of the Security Council, and that process of emulation that was pushing more and more countries to intervene militarily elsewhere. That is why if you go and read the news today, and you see that Russia is putting satellites, military satellites in the atmosphere, which is the big news today, as you know. If you see that Russia is waging a war for 2 years now against Ukraine, the second anniversary is coming in a week time of that war. If you see that Israel is doing massacres in Gaza and does not seem like stopping tomorrow, if you think that something could happen in the Strait of Taiwan between China and the United States, you can stop at each of these events and other events and explain them in se et per se, in themselves. But if you have the big picture in mind, you would put all this under one big title, the deregulation of force. That the force, the use of force, is not regulated anymore as it should be. So yes, after that original sin of 2003, Russia attacked Georgia and decided that 2 parts of Georgia are independent countries. Then a few years later, it attacked Ukraine and annexed Crimea and deployed forces in the Donbass and went again to war against Ukraine a few years later in February 2022. China is not going into war, but is doing a number of things that are extremely destabilizing in the South China Sea, around Taiwan, acts of intimidation that can slide easily into war. In the meanwhile, these are big countries. If you look a bit lower, you will find that middle-sized countries have done an even more intense use of their force. Take Turkey. Turkey has intervened in Libya massively while I was there in 2019. Has brought mercenaries from Syria to fight in Libya. Has intervened in northern Iraq as late as yesterday against the PKK, the Kurdish movement that is based in the region called Kandil, and has been bombing big time Rojava, which is the Kurdish enclave in northern Syria. If you look at another country like Iran, you will find that Iran is now more or less directly involved in training and supporting Hamas, in training and supporting Hezbollah in Lebanon, in training and supporting the Houthis in Yemen, who are disrupting international navigation in that area, and is training and supporting armed groups in both Syria and Iraq that have been attacking American presence in these two countries. If you look at Israel, it's no different. Israel has been doing what you see in Gaza. But Israel before that, before October 7th, has been extremely active in intervening in Syria, in Lebanon, even in Iran itself, through cyber war or directly against Iranian science people. So it is as if Israel is at a permanent military intervention and has internalized the deregulation of force. But if you look a bit lower in the international system, you will find that a few countries who have the means and the trained armies for that have transformed themselves into what you may call little Spartas. Little Spartas. That is, little garrison countries that are intervening in other countries. I can give you a number of examples for that. Let me take one of the most active one, Rwanda. Rwanda today is very active in the eastern part of Congo, is interfering in the Central African Republic, has sent troops to Mozambique, has been playing the little Sparta of Africa, sometimes with the UN authorization, and very often without any authorization by anybody. And with motivations that are publicly that African problems should be solved by African soldiers. But very often you see that companies related to the president's party come in the wake 2 months, 3 months after the soldiers of his armies come and try to make deals and to make money in the countries where. So you have the big powers who are more war prone than before. You have the mid-sized powers not hesitating to use direct force or proxies in order to advance their interest. And you have little Spartas who are making money basically and getting a lot of influence by operating here and there in their direct environment. So the force, we live in a world where the force is largely deregulated and where the codification of the use of force that has been very positive across the 20th century has somehow dissipated in the past few years. That is why, and I may conclude with that, I do believe, I have asked myself very often, why can't we who practice international relations or who study international relations, in my case I do the two, why are we so unable to give a name to that period, 1/3 of a century, like 34 years, that go from the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1999, 1990, until today? Why are we unable to give it a name? The way we called the period before the Cold War, because there was a Cold War between the powers and a lot of real wars among their proxies in Korea, Vietnam, Africa, Mozambique, Angola, Middle East, you name it, Cuba, Nicaragua, you name it. Why are we unable to call that period from 1990 to 2024? Why to give it a name? I think the reason is that that period is made of two sub-periods that are contradicted. From 1990 to 2003 or 4 or 5, the first reaction of the international system to the fall of the Berlin Wall was to use the opportunity in order to regulate force, to reduce substantially, which they did, the nuclear arsenal of the big powers, Russia and the United States, going down from like 30,000 nuclear warheads to less than 6,000, in creating the International Criminal Court, the Rome Statute, in using the concept of collective security properly in the war in Kuwait, in doing a number of things that are positive, and that in the second half of that period, since say 2003, until now, we have been much less active in doing that and much more passive in seeing all these countries interfere in clear contradiction with the UN Charter and international law everywhere. So you cannot give a single name to a period that is so contradictory between its first half and the second half. Why is that so? There are a number of reasons for that. Since time is short, I will only remind you of some of these things. Titles, only the titles. First, democratization. You know that democracies tend to be more peaceful than authoritarian regimes. We have seen a huge wave of democratization until the year 2006, but we have seen a plateau since and a regression more recently. Yes, you have elections everywhere, but as you know, the elections in the Comores are not legal. The elections in Bangladesh on January the 4th were a farce. The elections here and there is not real democracy. So democratization, while very promising between 1990 and 2006, has somehow regressed, not to mention the coup d'etats in the African Sahel, in Thailand, in Myanmar, and so on. Second, globalization was going very quickly, and you know that there is an old theory developed by Kant and by Montesquieu and by others that when trade do not invade. The idea that when you trade with another country, you are not supposed to invade it. Well, globalization, while very rapid in terms of trade, of foreign direct investment, until the financial crisis of 2007, has been slower since. As if you look at the figures for last year, for example, for American investment in China or for foreign trade, etc., you see that the figures are not growing. They are, on the contrary, declining. The third thing is that the revolution in technology, which is central, and for some people is the central phenomenon of these times, has been in the first time very good for the man in the street, because with your smartphone, with your laptop, etc., you became an immediate reporter and an opinionated writer, etc. Freedom of expression for all. Saudi Arabia has 100% internet users, China the same, etc. But in the past 10, 15 years, we have seen that this technological revolution has been used more often to develop weapons, to develop systems of surveillance, than to promote the freedom of everybody. Finally, I would mention the nuclear issue, because nobody was expecting that we go back to it. The first 15 years had been great in terms of reduction of the arsenals, in terms of proliferation. For example, in 1995, the Treaty of Non-Proliferation, the NPT, Non-Proliferation Treaty, has been renewed indefinitely without opposition from all the countries who were not nuclear. But now what we see is that Russia is putting nuclear weapons into space. America is devoting huge amounts of money to renew its nuclear arsenal. The same in the UK. China has decided to go from 1,500 warheads to double that figure, 3,000 warheads by the year 2030. That 4 countries are de facto members of the nuclear club without being de jure, according to the NPT members of that club, that is India, Pakistan, North Korea, and Israel. And that Iran is probably on the verge of becoming a nuclear power as well. This means that other countries, because you have like 20, 25 countries in the world, including yours, who probably have the technological ability to become nuclear powers, who probably are thinking again of their decision to sign the NPT and not to be nuclear powers. For all these reasons, yes, the post-Cold War, these 34 years, has been divided into two completely contradictory parts. And for these reasons, we are now following a number of wars across the globe. I hope we don't have other wars on our plate in the weeks and months to come. Thank you.